Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session. My name is Cindy Haight. I'm very excited to be here today to introduce the SGS webinar for the COP27 and GHG training needed for your organization. We can take a look at the agenda for today. We will tell you a little bit about SGS. We'll discuss the 5 North America drivers for climate change, 6 key takeaways from COP27, 6 stages of climate action, 5 critical areas for greenhouse gas training, next steps, and then we will certainly set aside time to answer your questions. I do encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A area as they come up, and we will be sure to address your questions. My name is Cindy Haight. I'm an inside sales rep for SGS. I've been with the company for just about a year now, but I come with over 20 years of experience in the certification and training industries. Today, I assist with customer requests for certification and training to the core ISO standards, including ISO 9001, 14001, 45001. I assist with requests for ISO 13485, which is a medical device standard, as well as requests for SMETA audits. I support client training needs through SGS Academy. We have a full catalog of training courses that are available for private instruction as well as public enrollment. We have a list of classes available in the sustainability sector that Adam will get to throughout the presentation today. Let me take a moment to introduce you to our speaker. We have Mr. Adam Hammes. He's the ESG Director for SGS North America. Adam comes to us with 20 years of experience as a corporate ESG and sustainability consultant, author, and instructor. He's the founder of multiple organizations and an MBA with international education and leadership experience, integrating ESG, CSR, and sustainability into corporate strategies. And you can see just a few of Adam's esteemed credentials listed there. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about SGS. We are the leading inspection, verification, testing, and certification company. We are globally recognized as the benchmark for both quality and integrity. You can see we're a very large organization. We employ 96,000 employees globally in 2,700 offices, and we offer expertise across 11 industry sectors. We've been in business for just shy of 150 years, and you can see some of our milestones on the slide. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Adam. Again, please post your questions in the Q&A area. And Adam, go ahead and take it away. Everyone enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Cindy. I very much appreciate it. And hit the wrong button. Sustainability is not new to SGS. It is embedded within the company. It's in our values from the top with the CEO all the way down through committee positions and dedicated internal and external employees focused on the topic. We have not come to this recently. We've been doing it for at least over 25 years, and SGS has been at the forefront, launching schemes and certifications, designing trainings, becoming the first accredited provider of verifications of those trainings, doing report assurance. We were just integrated into the industry, and we have been for a very long time. We continue to be a leader moving forward. So there's just a highlight of some of the things that you can see. We're also recognized. It's nice to work in it, but we've been recognized as a leader for a very long time, and we continue to do that year over year with EcoVadis, DJSI, ISS, MSCI, Sustainalytics, CDP. We've been carbon neutral since 2014. Any third parties that do judge and rank your performance usually rank us very well, and we take great pride in making sure that we do that every year. So a quick question to everyone, just to keep you engaged. Has your organization completed a baseline carbon footprint or GHG emissions inventory? Yes, no, or very valid, I don't know. I can tell you that our organization has, but maybe take a minute. I'll give you a few more seconds to put in your answer. The quiz should have popped up. Has your organization completed a baseline carbon footprint? The technical term is a GHG emissions inventory. If people say them, they're basically the same thing. Yes, no, or I don't know. And so we've got a good split. So yes, no's, and about 25% in the I don't know. Typically, you can go on your website and look if there's a CSR report or a ESG report or a sustainability report, and it would be included in there unless it's very new. So that's one tip for finding out, but it's not uncommon. Some companies have, some companies are starting to, and some companies are not sure. So let's talk about the drivers for doing a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Why are companies working on climate change in the first place at all? In North America, and this is where we're going to focus, I oversee delivery services for the US and Canada. And I will say this is not new. If you go back to the 90s, there are companies that just believe and have believed strongly in climate change since that, and there have been companies doing this work since the mid-90s. So, but today in North America, why it's really changing, and I would say if you look around, the tipping point is the ESG ratings, and there's pressure from publicly traded companies that have ESG ratings. That's not all companies, but definitely that is true, and it's happening. DJSI, MSCI, ISS, Sustainalytics, and now even EcoVadis. These are ratings that are giving you a performance indicator and showing how you compare to your peers. And so that is definitely moving the needle for publicly traded companies, especially with investors and financiers. And then we can look at not even if you're publicly traded, but if you're in the supply chain of a customer who is publicly traded and they're trying to improve their score, that often creates pressure for you in the supply chain, and your company needs to then increase your performance. And scores are one very clear way to increase that performance and have it validated. So increasingly, these weighted ESG scores, they're proprietary in most cases. They're being prioritized within the supply chain. So here's some big brands, but there are, say, 400 and some brands, for instance, in EcoVadis. Those brands are mandating or requesting that their suppliers participate and get a score so that they can improve their supply chain and manage it more closely. A lot of the mandates are specifically around climate change still to this day, but that has bled out into broader ESG issues. But those supplier disclosures are really moving the needle into the small and medium-sized companies and the privately held companies. And you can thank EcoVadis and CDP for that. And then what a lot of people talk about, which is often newsworthy, is really probably the number 3 driver, is regulatory pressure. You know, Canada has a notice, a very general notice that has TCFD requirements listed as a suggestion, but it doesn't have a lot of teeth. But in the US, you know, there were proposed US federal supplier rules recently that are going to go into effect probably January, February. Those are really for CDP and SBTI. Those are for suppliers if you have a government contract. So that is going to be a disclosure into CDP and to set science-based targets. But that's a small group of companies that are only supplying the US government. The thing that got talked about a lot more, which was delayed in court, we expected it to, and it will probably take about a year to, but we fully expect it to be approved, is the US SEC ruling that is really about climate change disclosures for all publicly traded companies of a certain size. And we'll talk about those in a second. So that's what's getting a lot of talk. The only regulations in North America that have a lot of teeth here that people talk about are these. So let's talk about the US Federal Suppliers Climate Risk and Resilience Rule. It was proposed at COP27, which we'll talk about just in November of this year. The public comment closes in January 13th, so we expect it, if it's going to be approved, it'll be late January, early February. And it's really about major contractors or significant contractors and everyone else below the $7.5 million mark. It should have an M beside it. It doesn't. will not have to disclose, but anyone over 7.5 million will have to start disclosing to the CDP. Major contractors have to include scope 3 as well. Significant contractors only have to do scope 1 and 2. And then major contractors also have to submit science-based targets, which is to align with the Paris level treaty, 50% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. So those are the rules, and that's how they play out. It's the annual obligations if you're a federal contractor to the US government. So that will just increase disclosure. I try to remind everybody that these are all about disclosure, and they're mostly focused on investors. This one is focused on the federal government being the pressure. The SEC ruling, if you hadn't seen the timeline for this, which obviously could change, it's all still in debate, but that is even for the largest, it's really focused on accelerated filers, large accelerated filers are the ones that have this 2023, you have to create a baseline, and then in 2024, you have to file your climate disclosures, and then it just ratchets up slowly over the course of 5 years, which with limited assurance, which is getting your data verified, and then reasonable assurance, 5 years out, which is a higher level of assurance and getting your data verified. And then if you're smaller companies, accelerated, non-accelerated, you start adding years to this, and it's a very long, drawn-out process, even though people get pretty excited about it. But there is a clear kind of slow ramp up with all of this, and it's not even approved yet. So then a fourth driver that we'll talk about is consumer pressure. If you're a consumer directly selling to consumers, there's a growing market. It's defined as LOHAS, the Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability. That group has been shown not only to represent a huge global market, $546 billion, but it's growing as a percentage of market per country. And those are individuals who are willing to spend either if products are similar in quality and similar in price, but one is more environmentally or socially responsible, they would choose the one that is more environmentally or socially responsible. Or if one is, or they're willing to spend a little more actually to choose the thing that is environmentally healthy or socially responsible. So that's a big deal for people with their wallets, voting with their wallet, they often call it. And so in the US specifically, you can see some of these other countries, we're not as high as Japan and New Zealand, but we're growing at about a 10% increase, and that's not 23 to 33%. Obviously, it's a 10% of that market share is growing, and so it's going to continue to scale up. According to McKinsey, looking broader, 70% of consumers are willing to pay for more of a green product that performs just as well as the non-green product. That's more price parity. The LOHAS is really more focused on people who are willing to spend extra and pay more for something, even if it's not price parity. And then about half of the companies surveyed through this consumer survey stated that business growth was driving their sustainability initiatives. So entering new markets, offering new products and services with a sustainability bent was actually the main reason they were doing it. And then last but not least is that as we do look at the talent war, North America driver number 5 is employee pressure. So if you look at a survey by Unily in 2020, 2,000 UK-based office workers, this is not in North America, but it gives you a sense that 83% of them thought their employer was not doing enough to tackle sustainability and climate change, and 65% would prefer working for a different company with more robust policies. It's a pretty big deal to consider. And then IBM's 2022 Institute of Business Value IBV survey, which happens every year, is 16,000 employees across 10 countries said that 67% were more willing to apply for and accept positions with a company they felt was quote unquote more sustainable. Now this is definitely, there's differentiation, high level skill positions, higher up leadership positions that are harder to fill. This becomes more of an issue if you have, frontline workers, minimum wage jobs. This obviously does drop down. It's not as big of a differentiator, but as you ratchet up these higher skill positions, kind of blue collar, white collar difference, you'll see it. And I think we'll continue to see it grow as it's harder and harder to find talent and there's more options out there for candidates. So what is your organization's number one business driver for climate action? Or if you're considering taking climate action and you haven't yet, what do you think your organization's number one business driver would be for considering it? Is it because you're getting ESG rated and you want to improve? Is it because a supply chain customer of yours is putting pressure on you? Have you seen the regulations and your organization does feel it's going to be an impact? Are your consumers that you're selling to directly asking for it? Or your employees asking for it, or some other? Now, it could be a combination. It typically is, but what is your number one driver? What do you think the most important thing is? And I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. We'll go forward. All right, and this is really telling. It's not unheard of. I'm a little surprised that regulations are the lowest, but it could be just our group. The supply chain customer is very high. The ESG ratings, it's definitely, there's a limit because you typically have to be, it's not always, but you do have to be publicly traded unless you go through a specific process. And then if you're using EcoVadis, that widens the scope quite a bit. If you consider that a true ESG rating, then EcoVadis really, the umbrella gets a lot bigger. And then consumers, we definitely have some consumer selling companies here. So that's a perfect group to talk to. And then a little extra question, were you paying attention to the recent COP27 conference? If you know what COP27 was, because we're going to just do a rough summary of what came out of that. But were you watching this November? Yes, no, or what's COP27? Don't even know what we're talking about. Take a few moments to answer. So we got a lot of people paying attention, which is good, and no, and at least people are familiar with COP27. Conference of the Parties is the acronym. I just had a non-environmental or non-sustainability person telling me how dumb it was that they name the, because we're just started COP15, and they were confused about why this COP15 happened after COP27. And I tried to explain to them, well, Conference of the Parties is a generic term that the United Nations use, but it's specific to the theme of that particular conference. We just started the biodiversity conference in December, and COP27 was specifically related to the climate change conference of the parties. It's the 27th one, thus why they call it COP27. There's 165 signatory nations in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. It was from November 6th to the 18th. It's quite a long time. News keeps coming out of it. It's a lot of negotiations, a lot of, it's basically just a lot of negotiations, a lot of conversations, a lot of presentations and speakers. This one was in Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt. And that's what we're referring to. And we're going to just show you the highlights. There were a lot, you could never talk about all the different things that happened, but the kind of results or the big themes, if you want to take the takeaways to what happened this year. Number one was loss and damage. This is a fund, and it's been talked about, but it's never been included in the final draft agreements that they come out with. And loss and damage is a multi-billion-dollar fund, really for developing countries. A lot of it's driven by the small nations that have been and continue to be the first that are affected by climate change and the worst. They literally fear that they're going to disappear and that all of their people are going to have to immigrate into other countries, and that's what they try to leverage. Is the other people like, are you going to be able to handle all of our citizens moving into your country, like flooding into your country? And the big change is it's not defined yet, but there is the language is in there that we will have a loss and damage fund. The smaller countries wanted it to be 100% funded by the developed countries. That language, for better or for worse, was kind of broadened to say a diverse source of funding. The developed worlds, the rich countries, wanted to include things like China and India because they're huge emitters of CO2, but they're also still considered developing countries, so they would not have been on the hook. So in a way, it's good that China and India are still in the mix, but it's not requiring them. It just didn't limit it and keep them out of it. And there's a whole lot of definition that has to be put around it. But the biggest thing probably was that people put a lot of attention on what is this loss and damage fund? It got approved, and now it needs to be developed and implemented. And it's rich countries helping developing countries deal with the negative impacts of climate change. It's not preventing climate change from getting worse, which a lot of people then put the focus on number two, said we need to keep this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, which a lot of people are saying is unrealistic because countries are not moving fast enough. We're not doing enough to limit the damage of climate change. They did keep it in there. We recommitted to 1.5 Celsius as the maximum increase in temperature globally as an average, but that means we need substantial reduction commitments from countries now. So again, a lot of these do take time, but people were excited, but definitely pointed out there's a long way to go. The phasing down, number three, of fossil fuels was the language that was used. People have kept pushing for phasing out instead, but they always take out the out and say phase down fossil fuels. They directly named coal as one of the fossil fuels specifically, but they never actually say any of the others like gasoline or some of these high emitting things. There's some focus put on methane, but there's still, again, people complain there's not enough very specific things. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? They included the term low emissions energy also, instead of, we're going to get rid of fossil fuels. There's a lot of fossil fuels that are still slightly lower than other fossil fuels in emissions. And so some people were frustrated that the language wasn't direct and clear enough to make sure that we were going to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Number four, I throw this in here because we're in North America, but the USA did have two very specific things happen during COP27. So we wanted to point it out, even though that a lot of people were unhappy with the intensity of the commitments and, is it enough, that the USA did release their CDP and SBTI supplier rule that was announced during COP, right at the beginning, sort of early on in COP27, as something that they were willing to do. And then there's been talk of potential sanctions. There's a specific type of sanction that can be used against illegal acts around the world. And Brazil and deforestation came up as a major topic. And the idea was floated that the US was willing to consider using those particular sanctions, which are pretty stringent, on any company or country that was found to be illegally contributing to the deforestation of Brazil. And so those two things did come out of the US specifically. Women in leadership was talked about quite a bit. The absence of it, that maybe we're increasing and improving, but not nearly fast enough, and that women need to have a voice at the table. Definitely with climate change, and new EU law was announced that 40% of non-executive board members of large companies would have to be gender balanced with women by a certain date. I don't remember the date, but that law was recently announced. As one example of people, it's always a theme, and then countries step up and say, we can do this to move the needle and to make things better. So that EU law was one example. And then also the voice of children and biodiversity, just not wanting to get drowned out. Those were talked about quite a bit, saying it's important that youth have a voice and that we're protecting biodiversity as a major aspect of climate change mitigation. So they did have a whole physical area for youth. More youth were invited to this event, and they were trying to give just voice to our future generations. And then they pointed to a lot of what's happening now, December 7th through the 19th, is the UN's Biodiversity Conference, or COP15, that they really want that conversation for climate change to lead into what's happening now and say climate change issues should be driving even more biodiversity protection around the world. And they're really looking for this 30 by 30, where every country by 2030 is protecting 30% of its biodiversity. And that's going to be hard to do. But that's what happened this year. Those are some of the biggest themes. There's a lot more if you go out there and want to look into it, but just to know that that's what has occurred, and it's the international kind of conversation that's going to be moving forward from today. Knowing that, so we're going to show something from SGS. This is how we work with our clients. What are the 6 stages of your organization's climate action plan? Even no matter what you are as an organization, if you're going to take climate action, it's going to come into these 6 stages of development. They're cyclical. So each stage has evolving levels of maturity. As you go through this process, the second, the third, the fourth time, you're going to get more mature and better at it. None of these stages should be missed, though. We really point that out. You're going to create some elevated levels of risk if you skip stages and you don't go about it very thoughtfully. So I'll just point out that number one is training. You need to build internal competencies to understand climate itself, and then climate science, climate carbon accounting, and all the things, standards that you might need to adhere to. There's always training, and we just highly recommend taking training. There's also measurement. How do you measure your organizations or your projects' climate action footprint? Either it's a product, we'll talk about those in a second, but measurement is very key, something you should be trained on. Verification, are you going to get internal or external verification? What kind of assurance levels do exist out there, or even certifications that you get third party or at least independent parties looking at it to say, yes, this is accurate. Then you go down to the disclosure, mandatory disclosure, voluntary. What are the agencies or the frameworks or the standards you're going to use? How are you going to tell people your story? Because there's no point in doing it if you don't let people know. And then there's targets. How are you going to change in the future? They can be publicly made, they can be private, internal only, but you need to have goal setting and look at how you're going to make those improvements. SBTI validation is one example that sort of the entire world has lined up with the scientific basis of 50% reduction by 2030, carbon neutral by 2050, is what science tells us we need to avoid the worst, not to like have a rosy future, but to avoid the worst negative impacts of climate change. So it's not all that aggressive, actually. And then reductions is number 6, absolute reductions plus intensity metrics, which are both very useful to have because some companies are in growth mode and you still want to see if you're improving, but you look at your own operations and your supply chain, and then are you going to include offsets in that strategy? So all of that matters, and that's how you really should approach, and we always recommend approaching it. Get trained again after you've done it once, check your measurements, verify your data, disclose to the groups you're going to disclose to, set new targets, or at least confirm that your targets are the same, and then do the work, make reductions, see improvements in the system, and then start all it back over again. So what stage of climate action would your organization find the most challenging? Is it just getting trained? Is it doing the measurements? Is it finding third-party verification? Is it not being sure who to disclose to and where and when? Is it setting realistic targets? Or is it actually making the reductions and seeing those improvements in your operations or supply chain? Give you just a moment to think about it. And then I will look at this. Everybody, 100% is saying measurement. I don't know if I just clicked too fast, but that's a pretty good alignment. I've actually never seen that measurement is the key. Now, especially if you're getting into scope 3, measurement is just complicated. It's never as simple and straightforward, and scope 3 is becoming more and more an issue for everyone. And so that's, I'm glad you're here. So let's talk about training, because the way to solve this, I think in any area, training is the key. It's why it's number 1, because if you want to measure, you should be trained. Even if you're hiring someone else to measure for you, I still think you should have somebody internally trained, because you need to have the person who manages that relationship with that vendor also understanding how they're doing it, why they're doing it, being very actively involved in the process. So there's, I say 5, I should say 5, GHG Accounting, GHG Verification, which there is a slight difference. I want to show you, I'll talk about it. ESG Reporting is very high level. We'll talk about why I threw that in here. But then there's also training on GHG Reporting, and then training on setting GHG targets. So we're going to talk about each of those and why you should consider training, and maybe just to be thinking, what training do you need next to take your company to the next level in your program? One is GHG Accounting, and this is purely in how do you do your own inventory? How do you measure it? The number 1 organization that I'm going to talk about first, it's not the only one, was Greenhouse Gas Protocol that started very long ago. They've been around forever. 2001. They have a corporate accounting and reporting standard, which is pretty solid, but they have project-based guidance. They have scope 3 guidance. They have webinars. They have other things on their site. It's really been around the longest, and Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a fundamental must, in my opinion, that you should really understand it and download a lot of their stuff for free, but you can take training as well. They talk about how to set boundaries, how to do control approaches, emission types, gases, emission factors, calculation methodologies. They were everything before ISO came around. But they're purely on accounting. Greenhouse gas protocol is not a standard. It's not an accredited standard that you can assure to or verify to, although you can get a verification to greenhouse gas protocol. It's just non-accredited, which is still valuable, but it's not really considered a verifiable standard. But then you look at verification and you get into ISO, which has been around. It's actually in its second version. ISO 14064-1 came out in 2006, and now it's the 2018 updated version. That's really for organizational footprints. And it's different because greenhouse gas scope 3 supply chain emissions are completely voluntary in the greenhouse gas protocol, where they are not voluntary in ISO. You do have to look at direct and indirect emissions. They line up very well with greenhouse gas protocol, but that is different. Any material exclusions, whether they're scope 3 or indirect, you have to provide a justification for it, which means you have to try to measure it first. And then if there's a reason to exclude it, you can. ISO 14064-2 is for projects. That is a lot of registries, things that are looking for offsets, that they do just a specific project. What was the net benefit plus or minus for that specific project? And those include one-offs like new construction. And then 14067 is a product line footprint. You could look at a defined product line and only measure that. It's popular for retail, especially in high volume sales. But those are all different ISO standards in that same family of standards that are very popularly be used, and all of them can be verified by a third party with an accredited certificate and an opinion statement, which is definitely a higher level of assurance than a non-accredited GHG protocol. But some people use GHG protocol as a starting point where you can do scope 1 and scope 2 just to get your feet wet. And then once you're familiar with the process, move on to ISO and get an accredited certificate. So knowing that, here's some training. This is how we've designed our training from SGS at the SGS Academy. We have 4 modules on greenhouse gas specifically. The first 3 are all one day. So we'll have Intro to Carbon Accounting and Reporting. It's very entry level, but it's going to tell you about everything you need: climate change, climate action, context, the value of an inventory, policy and regulations, a lot of background information. Number 2 is actually quantification and reporting of GHG emissions. You're going to get into ISO, both GHG protocol and ISO 14064 specifically. And you're going to really talk about how to calculate. Module 3 is verification. It's going to talk about all the third-party verification from an assurance standpoint. What does that look like? How to get ready for it. It's really for maybe internal people so that you can say, are we going to get verified, and should we get verified? What's that look like for our team? And then if you actually want to become an auditor, which we hire, you become an ISO 14064 greenhouse gas lead verifier. It's actually the certificate. You would still have to get experience and log different audits, but that's actually one extra day where you still have to take all the 3 prerequisite modules, and then you take a 4th day for becoming an actual auditor. And you get a lot of practices, and it's more like a workshop. So all of those are coming out. They're going to be, the next series is in January, but you can just take the first module, or you can take the number 1 and number 2. I don't recommend jumping straight to like 3. You really should start doing just 1 and 2, 1, 2, and 3. Or the whole thing. And that's how they're designed. If you want to get into ESG reporting, this is a big picture. If you have a leadership role, especially, to find out that greenhouse gas is not the only thing that is reported in sustainability reports. And often there's an entire guidance section on how to report on climate change from GRI or from SASB, or there are other things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But if you have a higher level standard that your company is reporting to at a annual report level, I would always recommend learning more about GRI, learning more about SASB, so that you see how your climate change reporting fits into the bigger picture of the rest of the company's reporting, because it does need to align. GRI was established in 97. It's a framework and a standard. It's really double materiality, which means it's the impact on the business, but it's also the business's impact on the world. So how is society being impacted and the planet being impacted by your business activities? Whereas SASB is purely more for investors. It's established in 2011. It has 77 industry standards specifically. It averages about 5 topics and 13 disclosures per industry, so it's very easy to adopt. You just might not like the choices that they've made. It's sort of a done for you. If you're in this industry, disclose these KPIs specifically, and very focused towards investors. We have ESG and sustainability training that's higher level. So if you want to take that, you can start out with just our foundational course. It's going to be a video on demand course very soon in January. That's a half day, all the background on ESG and sustainability. You can take a full day course, which is live. It's on materiality and strategy that goes into leaders and basically how to use those high level standards to develop your strategy. And then there's a course on disclosure and communication. That is really for folks on the reporting team and how to align your communications after you've created your strategy, how to align those communications with the standards. And so those are coming up February 22nd, February 23rd. Like I said, in January, the video on demand course will be available to take at your own leisure. And then you need greenhouse gas reporting. So the big things, especially if you look at the regulatory pressure, CDP and TCFD are the two big things that get mentioned time and time again. So if you want to get familiar with those, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is a 4-category framework, not a standard. It just says you need to cover governance issues around climate change, strategy issues, risk management issues, and metrics and targets. It does not tell you the KPIs that you need to use, and it's very investor focused. And then CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, is the carbon side. There's actually CDP has a water and a forestry questionnaire now, but very few people use them compared to the carbon. So in the carbon side, they are a climate rating agency, and they will score you on your disclosures and give you a report card, kind of like an A, B, C, D. But you get points for just disclosing. So any transparency gets you points. They will give you points for performance, how you're doing in your goals and targets. And they'll also give you third-party verification can up your score in CDP, just to give you a little background on those. And if you want to, we're not an approved provider yet. I'll tell you that CDP and TCFD have their own classes. We're working to become an approved provider so we can, because we're really strong on training, but we have more so if you want to contact us. We have services in CDP, TCFD. We can help companies do that. We have services with emission inventories, science-based targets, verifications to all of these, and carbon neutral claims. But we are not yet an approved education provider. So I would just point you in their direction. Go check out CDP's classes. Go check out TCFD. They have something called the Knowledge Hub, and it's excellent. It's an excellent source of training. And last, GHG Targets. That's really talking about science-based targets is the big thing. It's the most popular and common. Like I said before, it's aligning with the Paris Treaty absolute reduction targets that scientists have told us we need to meet to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That's a 50% reduction by 2030 and a net zero or carbon neutral achievement by 2050. There's also PAS 2060. It's a 2014 version of PAS, and that's a carbon neutral standard. And that's really verifying claims that say we are net zero or we're carbon neutral. And it's you can verify to that PAS 2060 with an accredited certificate. It's a high quality certified carbon credit requirement that there are other kind of lower quality, I would say, certifications you can join, but those are kind of independently run branded types of things, whereas carbon neutral from PAS 2060 is an accredited standard, and it is different. People do like to use the certifications. You can. I'm not telling you not to. Just saying that these are kind of the highest level of quality is SBTI and PAS. If we go back to our course modules, you're going to learn about all of those, like carbon neutrality, science-based targets. You'll learn about those in our introductory module, and it's a great place. But you'll also, if you decide to become like a lead verifier or just want to take the full 4 days, at the end of that, you will learn very specific methodologies for verifying things like removals, offsets, green energy, net zero claims. You get a very detailed and specific training that fourth day on how you actually verify those things, whereas they're really talked about as what they are and how they apply in context in this first module. So all of that was a lot. And I think I might have missed one. So I will just say, what level of verification does your organization have in place? And so you could say none, and I'm going to just explain it to you here. Verification is internal review, means your financial team, ideally it's your finance team, they'll perform just like they would review your financials at the end of the year. They would review your climate change data and make sure that the resource data was correct, that the storage, the calculations were correct. They would do a very in-depth internal review, but it would be internally from your own company, ideally your finance team. An external review would be a third party, but it's not necessarily accredited. If you're going to do limited assurance and accredited, you have to basically get a negative opinion statement from a third party that does a statistically significant amount of sampling. And if it's accredited, they will have to have an on-site visit, but it will be a negative opinion that says, we did not find any information or evidence that would suggest that this information is false. Then reasonable is the highest level of rigor, where they would still do sampling. They would come to on-site visits, but then they would do more sampling to a more statistically significant amount, and they would provide a positive statement if it was actually found to be positive that would say, we found enough evidence to believe that this information is true. And that is, in the assurance world, it's just a common delineation. One is a less rigor, a little cheaper and faster, and reasonable is just the highest level of assurance that you can do. So if you do have verification, please select none, internal, external, limited, or reasonable. So nice balance here. Internal review, I would never not tell you, please do it. Get a third party, get the finance team. They will come in and kind of really nitpick your system and say, hey, this is not how we would do things from a financial standpoint. You don't have enough backup evidence, or you're not storing things, or these calculations, you're pushing emails instead of pulling reports. So it's a really good thing to do. And then what do you do next? The final review for your next steps is you got to decide that you're not doing an off-the-shelf, just, oh, I saw this other company do it, so this is what we're going to do. You really need to decide what's driving your program. So identify, what is it? Is, ESG ratings, are we trying to improve? Is that why we're doing it? Is it to help a supply chain customer feel better and keep working with us? Are we just trying to meet regulations? Are we trying to make our consumers happy? Are we trying to make our employees happy? What's the mix maybe? Is it 90% supply chain customer and 10% regulatory? But you should know that, and you really want to get clear with your superiors, why are we doing this at all? And then for stage one, I would say, this is what we're going to focus on. Understand the 6 stages, but say, what training do we need now? Understand where you are in the process, how mature is your program, and get training. You can't do it all at once, but you can start somewhere and get the right kind of training for your team. Even if you're depending on third-party vendors to help you, that's a great strategy, but you should still have internal people trained, because they're going to manage that relationship so much better if they are trained themselves. And then you can decide, what are the competencies that we're looking for? Do we just need the accounting, pure and simple? Are we, I'll just say it, some privately held companies may never do a verification, especially if they're really small. I still think it's a one-time, you should at least do it once to make sure that you're confident in your program. But accounting is absolutely necessary. So you might want to start with GHG protocol. Verification is still very valuable, even if you do it once. ISO 14064-1 is a great starting point. Learn about it. ESG reporting, if you are putting out an annual report and you are putting your climate change as just one section of a much larger report, I would learn about GRI and SASB and make sure that you're aligning with whatever your company is reporting on at the highest level. And then if you want to do GHG reporting, specifically put out your own, you could do a TCFD only report. You can do a CDP questionnaire. If those are the only types of reports you're going to do, then learn in detail about their systems and what they require and how to do it well and how to get the best score, and to be well received by those standards and agencies. And last would be targets. Are you at the point where you're ready to start setting some targets, especially if they're publicly facing? You're going to want to at least consider a science-based target, because if you don't do a science-based target, you will get asked about it, and people will say the entire world is signing up for science-based targets. Why are you not doing that? Why are you doing less? Or why are you doing more? Because that's sort of just now the standard, the industry standard. And then net zero is even further. That's the 2050, becoming carbon neutral, achieving net zero. And how do you do it? It would be very important to know how to calculate those things and what counts and what doesn't count as emissions and removals and green energy, or carbon offsets, all those things. So those are what you need to consider. There is no right answer except what's the right answer for you, your team, your company. But these are the considerations that you really need to ask yourself. And then this is the best one yet. I left plenty of time for questions. What questions do you have for me? Please open it up, and I will answer for the next 15 minutes. You can type into your Q&A section as well. There's a Q&A section on your right. There should be for you to just type it in. Pretty quiet. I tend to not want to believe that I'm just that good of a speaker and that I covered absolutely everything you could ever want to know. I will do that if we don't have any questions, but I'd rather get really specific. Who should we reach out to enroll in any of these trainings? So myself, Cindy, definitely go straight to SGS Academy. So great question, Michael. SGS Academy is the housing for all of our training. But if you want a kind of a custom specialized training, if you want an internal training, Cindy is a great person. She's on the sales team and she supports the SGS Academy. We can get directly training through her if you want it, especially if you want it private or on site at your company to your team, something like that. You can always reach out to me specifically. I do a lot of client questions, just really understanding where your program's at and what you might need. If you don't know what training you need, if you don't know what services you need, if you don't know what standards you should get into, I am an instructor for our ESG and sustainability modules. And so, I always recommend people start there. Our GHG modules are very popular. It's never a bad idea to start with those GHG modules. You'll find it all on SGS Academy. But I'm more than happy to have a conversation. Sophia Chin says, is there any protocol established between SGS and Costco in regards to GHG requirements for the supply chain vendors? That is, protocol, I will say I'm not even someone who could answer, we probably work with, we work with a lot of companies. So, but do we work with them specifically on greenhouse gas in the supply chain? I don't know the answer to that, Sophie, and I apologize. If you want to reach out to us afterwards, it's very possible. It's highly likely that we work with Costco. I just don't own any of those relationships, but we're a giant affiliate organization across, like we said, boots on the ground and all over the world. So I would have to look. We don't also like to just give that away publicly. We would just have to say, like, if you're with Costco, then we could definitely talk to you more. But if you're a supplier of Costco, then we would probably have permission to talk to you in detail and have a meeting. But it's a great question. So thank you. Just reach out and we'll talk about it offline. Joan says, do you have ISCC training for North American time zones? That's a pretty specific question, Joan. So I do know we have ISCC training. Whether we have it for North American time zones, are you saying that you looked and you only found different time zones? Because I do know that we have training. It would shock me if we didn't have it in North American time zones. So please do check the SGS Academy. But my answer is that absolutely we should. I know we offer the training, and therefore I don't know why it would be in time zones. If you want to email me and you see it's like Asia time zone, it might be a mistake. Maybe something happened. on the website. We could try to get that fixed. Rudy, are the same rules in effect for-profit and nonprofit organizations in the U.S.? It depends on what, Rudy, it's a great question. It depends on what rules you're referring to. The carbon accounting is what I'm assuming you're talking about. Yes, there is no separate carbon accounting for a nonprofit versus a for-profit. It's actually, you would want to use an organizational model, either the GHG protocol for corporate standard, basically, or the ISO 14064-1, and that is for any organization. It tells you how to draw a clear boundary, how to set a methodology, how to identify your emissions, all those things. It's more about, is it an organization, or is it a project, or is it a product line? There is no differentiation I've seen between a for-profit and a nonprofit. So great question. And that's not just in the US, it's kind of anywhere. Larissa says, thanks for the presentation. Yes, you will receive a copy of the slides and I believe a recording. You'll get an email after this. Alice says, are there other US disclosure regulations on deck? No, Alice, I mean, there could be, but I'll tell you that if they're on deck, they're really, really far away on deck. Disclosure specifically on greenhouse gas, and I'll tell you that around the world, all the standards are getting aligned, but greenhouse gas has been around long enough. There's so much agreement. There's so much agreement between the standards and the goals. That's the thing. It's why regulations are actually rolling out, usually specific to climate action, because it's been around and it's been tested for so long. And so most of them that you are seeing are CDP, TCFD, and or just you need to disclose your carbon footprint, which is more like an ISO 14064-1. So that's why they're all coming out. The reason I say they're not on deck is this SEC ruling is going to be, it's going to happen. It's at least probably another year. It's going to be debated. So they're not going to, I don't expect them to throw out a bunch of additional things. I think the supplier ruling from the White House, that's going to take a little bit, and that is going to be a public comment period, but that's going to happen quickly. I think the SEC ruling is the one that has the most legs, and it's the one that you should expect to eventually get adopted. There might be some tweaks to it, but I don't know of any others that are kind of in addition to SEC and the White House supplier ruling. Jennifer says, how does a small sales office start to develop an internal program? Well, I'll tell you, like GHG for one, Jennifer, if it's just a GHG program that you're talking about, then I would look at just take the first module, the greenhouse gas module, maybe 1 and 2. It's all the same tools. And you really just need to know the first step for every organization. The only first step realistically is you have to do a carbon footprint. You have to get a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. They're the same thing. And you need to decide what rules you're going to follow. Are you only going to do scope 1 and scope 2, or are you going to do that first and then add scope 3, or are you going to do an actual accredited certificate, which is you're going to start following ISO? But the only way to know that is to get trained and to really decide for yourself what's the best for your office. If you're going to do a full-blown, more sustainability program, then I would come take our ESG and sustainability modules, because they're going to give you the whole thing. We're going to talk about everything, and it's going to make sense of just the sea of possible things that you could do. And it's going to go from very confusing to very clear on like, oh, we should just do this. And it's going to make a lot more sense because we just kind of sort through everything and make it really easy to understand. Joanne, last time we looked, it was only EU time zones. Thank you. I will make a note of that, because ISS is very popular in Europe, but is also here. We do ISS here. So if you see me, I'm looking furiously for my pin. I'll just make sure I get the download from this. I'll look that up and see if we have any North American time zones. But thank you for letting me know. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Rudy, yes, it should be emailed to you just because you attended. So yes, you will get a copy in an email after this. And those are the only ones that I see. Any other questions? These are great questions. And thank you for bringing some of those things like time zones to my attention. I want to thank everybody for attending. This was great. We usually there's so many questions during the middle of it. We almost get to the end and don't have time. So I was just looking, we had a great attendance. I appreciate all of your questions. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn about greenhouse gas and what's coming next. So definitely reach out to us if you have any further questions at all, but that is wonderful. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.